Hey, what's going on, wrestling fans? It is yours truly, TJ Jones, and welcome to another edition of the TJ Knows Wrestling Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. On this edition, we're going to be talking about Stone Cold Steve Austin. And man, it goes without saying, Stone Cold Steve Austin will go down in history as have to be top two greatest wrestlers of all time. Now, I mean, when we're talking about sports and entertainment, when we're talking about a guy that can generate excitement, when we're talking about a guy that was over like Rover, look no further than Stone Cold Steve Austin. But Stone Cold Steve Austin, his rise to the top, I mean, it didn't come without a lot of bumps in the road, so to speak. I mean, Stone Cold Steve Austin, for a long time, definitely wasn't one of those guys that people would pick to be the face of their organization. And it took a lot of growing pains and a lot of heartbreak in order for the Texas Rattlesnake to get to where he was. And right now, I got the bio of Stone Cold Steve Austin, tell you a little bit about his life. He was born Stephen James Anderson on December 18th of 1964 in Victoria, Texas. And Stone Cold Steve Austin, he actually started out playing football, man. He ended up going to North Texas University, home of the Mean Green out there in Denton, Texas. And Stone Cold just realized that he had a bigger calling, man. And his calling was professional wrestling. He was a guy that was a big fan of professional wrestling. He grew up in the Texas area. And for those that probably grew up during that time, that the biggest wrestling organization during that time was ran by the Von Erichs. I mean, you had the Von Erich brothers, Kevin Von Erich, you had Kerry Von Erich. I mean, you had Fitz Von Erich, who was the patriarch of the family. And I think at the time, it was called World Class Championship Wrestling, if I'm not mistaken. And it owned the Texas territories. And Stone Cold Steve Austin became a fan, and he ended up leaving North Texas University to pursue a career in professional wrestling. And Stone Cold Steve Austin, who was known as Steve Anderson at the time, he was, trained by the gentleman Chris Adams. Okay, the gentleman Chris Adams, who is a great worker, and he is known throughout wrestling ranks as one of the best workers that you can find. And he trained Stone Cold Steve Austin, and Stone Cold, he worked a little bit in the Texas territories, anywhere he can try to find some work. And, he also worked, saying throughout the South. He ended up getting the name of Steve Austin from Dutch Martell. Some of you probably know him in his later years as Zed Coulter. He managed Jack Swagger during the time. But Dutch Martell actually gave Stone Cold his name, naming him Steve Austin. And Steve would say that he was a little bit reluctant about carrying a name because Steve Austin was also the name of a very popular 80s show called The $6 Million Man, who was the star of that show was Lee Majors. And his name on the show was Steve Austin. So nevertheless, he decided to take the name, and the rest is history. I mean, it carried him for the rest of his career. Stone Cold Steve Austin got an opportunity to go to WCW. This was during the time where I can remember, man. This is one of those moments where, as a kid, I can really say that I've watched Steve Austin my entire life. Like I've seen from this point to where he is now, I've seen it. In WCW, he came in as Stunning Steve Austin, man. He was at this time, he wasn't the guy that we see behind me right now. He didn't have a bald head, but instead he had long blonde hair. He came out there with the robes, Ric Flair style. And he was Stunning Steve, man. And he was out there, he was a bad guy and always using backhanded antics in order for him to win his matches. And he won several championships, man. I can remember him winning the United States Championship and the television championship. And he was one of the best heels in WCW, man. I think he was very underrated at this time, a great, solid worker. I can always remember watching him on WCW Saturday night and putting on some really good matches there. But then, WCW, for some apparent reason, didn't see him as a top guy. I guess some of the matches that he was putting on with like the Natural Dustin Rhodes and Johnny B. Bad and crew, I guess that wasn't good enough for them. So instead, they decided to put him in a tag team with Brian Pillman, who was known as Flying Brian, and together collectively they were known as the Hollywood Blondes. And they were a good tag team, man, good solid tag team, using heel tactics and stuff like that, like to win matches. And I can always just remember, they used to come out there with the vest, and they had the star on the back of it and stuff like that, because they were supposed to be Hollywood. And I can just remember Stone Cold Steve Austin always, doing the little camera roll thing. I mean, that was pretty cool. And Stone Cold Steve Austin said that wasn't really him, but Brian Pillman, who was his best friend at the time, helped him to embrace that gimmick, and he even gave him a gold chain to walk down to the ring, because Brian thought it would be a great idea for them to come out there, with gold chains on. And it's actually the gold chain that you will mostly see in Stone Cold Steve Austin promos and stuff like that. He carried that gold chain with him everywhere he went, and that was a gift from Brian Pillman. But nevertheless, Stone Cold Steve Austin, at this time, Stunning Steve Austin and Brian Pillman, I mean, they were a really good, solid tag team. They ended up breaking up and having a feud together and stuff like that. But I would truly believe that this was probably the height of their career. You know what I'm saying? Not so much Steve Austin, but definitely Brian Pillman. But it just was one of those things where you had people coming in like Hulk Hogan, you had Ric Flair, you had Macho Man Randy Savage, and you also had guys like Hall and Nash that were about to come in. And there was really not a place for Steve Austin. Steve Austin ended up, being at home one day, and he ended up getting a phone call from Eric Bischoff, firing him over the phone, told him his services were no longer needed. And Stone Cold Steve Austin always would say that he felt like this was a cowardice move by Eric Bischoff, and he was really, really angry. But he ended up getting a phone call from Paul Heyman. Paul Heyman asked him to come down, and maybe work in ECW. And at this time, Stone Cold Steve Austin, who was at home due to injury, he told Paul that he was injured. And Paul said, "No, it's fine. I just need you to cut some vignettes." Cut some promos, excuse me. So Austin went down there to ECW, and a lot of people say that this was the infancy of the Stone Cold Steve Austin character, because some of the promos that he was cutting, I mean, he was very angry. I mean, he was frustrated at the fact that he got fired over the phone by Eric Bischoff. His classic promo, him climbing a ladder, in the middle of a match between the Sandman, I want to say Mikey Riffrack, and he said, "I wish I could climb the ladder of WCW like this." But it was just little nuggets that kind of, was the start of the Stone Cold Steve Austin character. He didn't stay long in ECW. I think he may have had a handful of matches, but he ended up getting a call from the big time. He ended up getting a call from WWF. This was during a time where gimmicks reigned supreme, and everybody had a gimmick, and everybody had a job, and everybody was around here being Quang and Portuguese Man of War and Deuce the Dumpster Drozy. So Stone Cold actually came in as the ringmaster. He was ringmaster Steve Austin. He was managed by Ted DiBiase. He was the $1 Million champion, and it just didn't work, man. I mean, you had yourself. He was a solid worker. A good hand, but he didn't really stand out at all, and he didn't like the character. So he wanted to change things up. He wanted to come up with a different name. So he always talks about the story about him sitting at home with his wife, and he was trying to figure out a name. And he had like a list of names that the WWF office gave him at the time, and he was trying to go through the names. And as he went through the names, like, his wife brought in some tea for him, and she wanted him to drink it, while it was hot. And she said, "Make sure you drink it while it's hot. You don't want your tea to be stone cold." So he ended up giving him his name, Stone Cold Steve Austin, because the light bulb came on. He's like, obviously, Steve Austin. So anyway, he ends up becoming Stone Cold Steve Austin, and his rise to fame came at the King of the Ring, man. It came at the King of the Ring. The first match he took on Wildman Mark Miro, he ended up beating Wildman Mark Miro, ended up busting his lip. He had to go to the hospital to get stitches, and he ended up being in a finals match with Jake the Snake Roberts, and Jake the Snake Roberts was on this whole road to redemption thing, and he was in the back. I'm talking Steve Austin. he asked, I want to say Michael P.S. Hayes, what did Jake the Snake say in his promo? And he talked about how he mentioned a Bible scripture of John 3:16 and in Psalms or something like that. So Stone Cold Steve Austin ended up beating Jake the Snake Roberts. He ended up walking up to the ramp, where the whole presentation was with the crown and the robe and everything like that. And Stone Cold Steve Austin cut the promo. You talk about your Psalms, you talk about your John 3:16. Austin 3:16 says, "I'll just whip your ass," and everybody just went absolutely crazy. I mean, and this was like during a time where, people wasn't really falling in love with the whole babyface gimmick anymore. Like people like white meat babyface, as they call it, the white boot babyface that comes out there smiling, happy to be there, dap everybody in the crowd. The crowd was really shifting and they were looking and clamoring and wanting something different. And Stone Cold was that difference. It didn't matter about a guy doing, heel like antics, because to be honest with you, Stone Cold Steve Austin was indeed a heel. And in most generations and most eras, he would be a heel. But people just loved his character. They loved the no nonsense, say whatever I want, I'm going to drink a beer after this match type guy. And I mean, he basically just took off. You've seen him take on Owen Hart for the Intercontinental Championship. He almost had he did have a setback because Owen Hart ended up dropping him right on his head and breaking his neck, like breaking his neck right in the middle of the ring during the time of his push. But that still didn't stop Stone Cold Steve Austin. But it did stop the way that Stone Cold Steve Austin worked inside of the ring. If you watch Stone Cold like during like the mid-90s, then you will see like there's a different work rate. I mean, he was a technician of all technicians. You will see suplexes, you will see chops, you will see a lot of the things that that you will see with in-ring technicians. But something happened with him when that whole Owen Hart situation. He had to taper it down and kind of change up his style because due to the fact of the complications with his neck. But anyway, he took on Owen Hart. But this big match that brought him to the top spot, in my opinion, was his match at WrestleMania 13 versus Bret the Hitman Hart. This was a classic example of what they call a double, a double turn. It's when the good guy comes into the match and he leaves as a bad guy, and the bad guy comes into the match and he leaves as a good guy. And these guys executed it absolutely unbelievable. I mean, stellar work between both of them. I know all of us can remember Bret the Hitman Hart putting a sharpshooter on Stone Cold Steve Austin as the blood is dropping down to his face. And Stone Cold Steve Austin does not tap out to the sharpshooter. He passes out, and Bret Hart ended up winning the match. Bret Hart leaves the match as the bad guy. Stone Cold Steve Austin leaves the match over as Rover as your good guy. So good quality match right there. That was it, man. That was the rocket fuel right there. You know what I'm saying? That was the rocket fuel that Stone Cold Steve Austin needed. We seen him win the Royal Rumble, and it set off a collision course in 1998. He versus Shawn Michaels. And this was during the time where Shawn Michaels was dealing with a back injury. He was about to leave because he had a classic casket match against The Undertaker. The Undertaker dumps him outside. It chips the back of Shawn Michaels, and his back wasn't the same. But he ends up going into a match at WrestleMania 14 versus Stone Cold Steve Austin. Stone Cold Steve Austin alongside Mike Tyson, Triple H. I mean, they basically built this match up. They built it up like, what was Mike Tyson going to do? They made Mike Tyson seem like he joined the Generation X. But Stone Cold Steve Austin ended up winning a match, becoming the WWF champion for the very first time. And that was it, man. I mean, he was a made man that night. Shawn Michaels passed the torch to him. He was leaving. You had like different stories to say that Shawn Michaels was talking about not dropping the belt to Steve Austin. You had The Undertaker with his hands taped up, because if Shawn Michaels didn't give the title over to Stone Cold Steve Austin, then he was going to beat him up. But I mean, look, they had all type of stories about this, but Stone Cold Steve Austin became the face of the WWF, man. But any face needs a heel. They need somebody that is going to be their yang to their yin. And you would think that it would be another professional wrestler, but instead it was Vince McMahon himself. This was Vince McMahon coming off the Montreal Screwjob of 1997, which Vince McMahon, for some apparent reason, thought that he was going to be looked at as the good guy for screwing Bret the Hitman Hart, who was going to WCW. Well, I was doing what was right for my company. Bret didn't want to play ball, but instead he ended up looking like one of the biggest douchebags in the history of professional wrestling. To screw Bret the Hitman Hart in his home country like that was just an absolute embarrassment. But you have Vince McMahon being the heel to Stone Cold Steve Austin, babyface, fan favorite persona, whatever. So you have Vince McMahon who runs the company, but he doesn't want the face of his company to be this beer swelling redneck who just comes out here and just cause all type of hell. He wants a suit. He wants a corporate guy. He wants a guy that toes the line, that dots the I's and cross the T's and says things that are politically correct. But this isn't Stone Cold Steve Austin. And what you had was just a collision course. And I can just remember when the feud first started, and the first month that it started, I mean, just some of the best television that you're ever going to find, from Stone Cold Steve Austin pulling out a prop gun and making Vince McMahon wet himself in the middle of the ring, from Stone Cold Steve Austin going into the hospital and hitting Vince McMahon over the head with the bedpan, just all type of classic stuff. I mean, him driving into the building on a beer truck, it was just so much crazy stuff that the writers and Vince McMahon, along with Stone Cold Steve Austin, came up with to put this feud over. And I think a lot of people I don't think a lot of people can argue that this probably is one of the greatest feuds in wrestling history. I mean, between two guys, right? Stone Cold Steve Austin, the employee, versus the employer, and Vince McMahon. So, I mean, this basically carried on for a good little minute, man, at least about a year and a half or two. Stone Cold Steve Austin was white hot. But there was one person out there, and I mentioned on the last episode of the TJ Knows Wrestling podcast, that was the 1A to his 1, and that was The Rock. He and The Rock were 1 and 1A, all right? These were the two guys that were carrying the organization, and this was something that was never seen. Usually you will see a top guy, and then you'll see guys that's kind of like right there, but not exactly the top guy. You can kind of tell who the top guys were. For example, back in the 80s, it was Hulk Hogan, but you also had Macho Man Randy Savage, and you had Ted DiBiase, and you had Sergeant Slaughter and Ultimate Warrior, but Hulk Hogan was the guy. But in the Attitude Era, it was The Rock and Stone Cold. And these two would have like really good classic matches. WrestleMania 15, The Rock versus Stone Cold Steve Austin. The Rock was the corporate guy. He was the guy that the people wanted. By people, I mean the WWF people. That's who they wanted. And Stone Cold Steve Austin wasn't the guy. They end up having a really good match. Stone Cold Steve Austin says that The Rock goes down in history as his favorite opponent of all time. And, they had some classic matches over the years. But then, you fast forward, Stone Cold Steve Austin, he's done some pretty decent things at this time. I mean, he, ended up working with some of the top stars in all of professional wrestling. You know what I'm saying? Like, he worked with The Rock. He worked with Kurt Angle. He worked with Triple H. I mean, just so many different guys. And here we hit like the year 2000. We're going to fast forward a little bit. Let's say 2001, where WCW was taken over by WWE. It was bought out, and you had the whole alliance dynamic. And a lot of people don't like the alliance dynamic. The fact that you didn't have the biggest stars in WCW come over. It was mostly guys like Chris Kanyon and Sean Stasiak and guys like that, and Shane Helms. But nevertheless, I mean, they did what they had to do. WWE felt as if Stone Cold Steve Austin needed to switch things up a tad bit. They thought that maybe his character was becoming a little bit stale. I tend to disagree. I mean, I can never get too much of Stone Cold Steve Austin, but instead they ended up, turning Stone Cold Steve Austin into a bad guy. Ended up turning him into, to a heel. He ended up being a leader of the alliance. You had some really funny things that he did though. Like I can remember him playing his guitar, saying "Kumbaya," getting on Vince McMahon's nerves. Then you had like him and Kurt Angle feuding. I thought that was pretty cool. You had Kurt Angle, as a good guy. And this was during the time, Kurt Angle, when he came in, he was a bad guy. So he transitioned to a good guy. And he had a feud with Stone Cold Steve Austin. I mean, they had one hell of a match in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania at a pay-per-view in Kurt Angle's hometown. Kurt Angle ended up winning the WWF Championship from Stone Cold Steve Austin. Stone Cold Steve Austin still was a heel at the time, but nobody really wanted to boo Stone Cold Steve Austin. Nobody thought that was a good idea, and I'm pretty sure that WWE realized it at the time. Stone Cold Steve Austin went back to being a good guy. And during this time, this was when the NWO came in. NWO came in, Hall, Nash, Hulk Hogan. Stone Cold Steve Austin at this time was feeling as if WWE creative was forgetting about him. It seems like, everybody else is starting to get their push. Everybody's starting to get over, but it seems like they're starting to forget about him. And the first writing on the wall in the eyes of Stone Cold Steve Austin was that WWF put him in a match against Scott Hall at WrestleMania. And Stone Cold Steve Austin felt as if he shouldn't have been in a match with Scott Hall because Scott Hall at this time was dealing with some personal things. He was doing some drinking and also, just all type of different things that was causing him hardship outside of the ring. Stone Cold didn't feel like, he was a reliable guy to go up against. But nevertheless, Vince McMahon decides that he is going to put him in a match still with Scott Hall. And the match was pretty good. I'm not going to lie about that, but Stone Cold Steve Austin felt like he should have been in a higher profile match, probably felt like he should have had the spot that The Rock had at that WrestleMania when he took on Hulk Hogan. We know that was a classic match, but, he felt like he was at the bottom of the card and he was looking at management like, man, look, I'm right here. But then the straw that broke the camel's back was when Vince came to him and said that he wanted Brock Lesnar to go over on him. And for those that don't know what go over mean, that means he wanted Brock Lesnar to beat Stone Cold Steve Austin on Monday Night Raw in a King of the Ring qualifier match. And Stone Cold Steve Austin was pissed off about this. I mean, he was upset. He was like, man, are you kidding me? No build-up, no nothing. So he ended up going to a Monday Night Raw, and then he just thought about, man, I'm getting on a plane, and I'm taking my ass home. So Stone Cold Steve Austin got on a plane, went home. And they call this, to this day in the world of wrestling, they say he took his ball and he went home. So Stone Cold Steve Austin leaves WWE. Vince is pissed off. Everybody's mad at Stone Cold Steve Austin. But Stone Cold Steve Austin stays away for quite some time until Jim Ross ends up sending Stone Cold Steve Austin a letter. And the letter was just on the lines of, if you need anything, if you need to talk, just let me know. Stone Cold Steve Austin calls JR. JR comes up with this proposal and says, look, if I can get you in a ring, if I can get you in a room with the old man, would you talk to him? The old man, he meant Vince McMahon. So Stone Cold said, yeah. Vince McMahon agrees. They both talk about what went wrong. But all in all, they decide to do business once again. Stone Cold Steve Austin comes back. Stone Cold Steve Austin gets one of the highest fines in the history of professional wrestling. I think he got fined over $500,000. Seriously, man, over $500,000 for walking out. He felt like that was wrong. He felt like it was a little bit too much, but nevertheless, he took it, grinned and bared it. And Stone Cold Steve Austin came back. He had some good moments and stuff like that. But Stone Cold Steve Austin body was starting to betray him during this time, and he did a lot of funny things, you know what I'm saying? Like him and The Rock, would go into a match at WrestleMania. Some funny things. The Rock having his concert, Stone Cold Steve Austin in the parking lot in his truck, with the windows tinted. He winding down the window because he winds up the window because he don't want to hear The Rock singing. I mean, it was just funny stuff, man. It was just absolutely crazy stuff. But once again, Stone Cold Steve Austin body was starting to betray him. And this leads to the WrestleMania in 2003, man. Stone Cold Steve Austin, the night before WrestleMania, ends up having to be hospitalized, man. I mean, it was something serious. Like, a lot of people didn't know if Stone Cold Steve Austin was going to be able to perform at WrestleMania due to the issues that he was dealing with. But Stone Cold Steve Austin, being a warrior that he is, and he respects The Rock so much, he went out there and he had a match, man, and it was, a classic match. He had his trademark vest on, and on the vest it had OMR on there, which stand for one more round. That was him retiring without really anybody knowing, and that was the final professional wrestling match that Stone Cold Steve Austin ever had, was against The Rock. Him losing to The Rock. There was an emotional moment inside of the ring where The Rock was talking to Stone Cold Steve Austin. Nobody really knows what was said between the two. It's something that they both carry, and if you ask them, they're not even going to tell you. But that was Stone Cold Steve Austin's last match. We know Stone Cold Steve Austin did a few more things, where he was the GM, and he would come back every now and then, for Raw anniversaries and all that kind of stuff. But he never performed in a professional wrestling match again. So that was the career of Stone Cold Steve Austin. And what can we take from the career of Stone Cold Steve Austin? To me, Stone Cold Steve Austin will go down in history as the greatest in-ring, I don't want to say in-ring performer, but the best gimmick, the best wrestling personality in history, okay? When you think about superstars, when you think about guys that took a company and brought it to another level, you think of Stone Cold Steve Austin. Now, I don't think that Stone Cold Steve Austin was the best wrestler of all time. I don't think that he was the best in-ring performer of all time. All right. But he definitely will go down in history as the greatest superstar of all time. I don't think you have to look at maybe Hulk Hogan, who probably drew more money than this guy. This guy took a company that was failing. You know what I'm saying? I think a lot of people forget that WCW was dominating at this time. And he took this company and he helped them get to that point where they surpassed WCW. So he definitely will go down in history as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, superstar of all time, depending on how you look at it. Before I go, I want to talk a little bit about the Elimination Chamber that took place on Sunday night. Look, this is the thing. I want to talk about the Elimination Chamber. I know a lot of people are upset, and as of right now, if you didn't see Elimination Chamber, I'll give you a few seconds to go ahead and cut it off before I start talking about it. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, look. So let's go ahead and talk about Elimination Chamber. My final thoughts. I'm not going to talk about every match, but this is my final thoughts. A lot of people are upset that the Miz cashed in his Money in the Bank contract, and Drew McIntyre, who has been a bold soldier and never really had his WrestleMania moment. He won a WWE championship with no crowd. This year there's going to have a little bit of a crowd inside of Raymond James Stadium. But look, here's the thing. I understand exactly what WWE is doing. I cannot believe anybody that's been watching wrestling longer than 10 years don't understand and don't see what the heck is going on here. I mean, look, what you have is WWE's way of having a WWE championship match with no complications, you know what I'm saying? Like no catch, no nothing, okay? And what I mean by that is, by the Miz cashing in his Money in the Bank right now, you can go ahead and just get it off of them. You can get that out of the way. Okay, the Money in the Bank is no longer a dynamic. We don't have to worry about that anymore. We give Miz the championship, right? What did you see before the Miz came out there? You seen him have a confrontation with recording artist Bad Bunny, who is now the 24/7 champion, right? I mean, Bad Bunny slaps the taste out of the Miz face. Damian Priest comes in and the Miz walks off, right? So what's that telling you right there? That the Miz is going to have to do something with Bad Bunny, right? That's number one. Point number two is Bobby Lashley. Bobby Lashley was put in a triple threat match simply so he can lose without losing, right? Because you had all this momentum. Just think about this. You have Bobby Lashley for the first time in WWE looking like a legit badass, and you want him to be in the WWE title picture. So how do you get the United States Championship off of him without him looking bad? You don't have him involved in the pinfall, right? So you have Riddle win, but he doesn't beat Lashley. He beats John Morrison. He becomes United States champion. So now you have Bobby Lashley, who is free of the United States Championship, and now can go on and have bigger fish to fry. Then you have Drew McIntyre, right? You got Drew McIntyre, and you don't want the predictability of a guy going into WrestleMania. You already got that on SmackDown with Roman Reigns. You know Roman Reigns isn't going to lose regardless, right? You don't believe that Roman Reigns is going to get pinned by whoever wins the Elimination Chamber match. So you pretty much know as a foregone conclusion he's going on to WrestleMania. So taking the title off Drew is not going to hurt him at all. The way that he was in the Elimination Chamber match, you already got the feud cooking up because Bobby Lashley came out there and cost him the championship, and the Miz comes out there. So here's what happens. You have yourself a pay-per-view in the middle of smack dab in the middle between now and WrestleMania, which is Fastlane. This is what I believe. I believe that the Miz is going to take on Drew McIntyre in a rematch for the WWE Championship, and Bad Bunny is going to cost the Miz his WWE Championship. And it's going to set up a tag team match, Miz and Morrison taking on Damian Priest and Bad Bunny. You do not, for the entire time since the Royal Rumble, have Bad Bunny feuding and doing all these different things with the Miz and Morrison for nothing to come of it. So anybody that believes that the Miz is not going to be doing anything with Bad Bunny, all I gotta do is tell you, man, you need to go ahead and just, check your wrestling knowledge or your ability to book, because this is so clear. All right. So Drew McIntyre is going to end up winning the WWE Championship, winning it back, and he's going to end up taking on Bobby Lashley at WrestleMania. That's just what's going to happen. People can say what they want to say about it. People upset. Oh, man, Bobby Lashley, he ain't getting pushed. Like, it comes a time, wrestling fans, it comes a time when you just got to sit back and just allow other guys to get built up, man, and see what happens. Like, nobody really cares if, nobody wants to see that. Well, if we have that mind frame, then nobody should be seen, because there's so much 50-50 booking going on in WWE too. Is ridiculous. Allow these guys to get over. I mean, I've been enjoying the fact that they repackaged Bobby Lashley and making him a legit badass by allowing MVP to really speak for him and allow him to just go out there and just kick ass. It makes him look much better. And since the Royal Rumble, Bobby Lashley has looked absolutely dominant. You cannot deny that. You may not like Bobby Lashley. You may not respect Bobby Lashley. You may think that he's a little bit lame, but they are booking him to look like a monster. It's almost like in the 80s, right? When you look at somebody like Earthquake, right? When you look at John Tenta, and I mean, you got this, pot belly big guy with a singlet coming on out here, jumping around the ring. And you know what I'm saying? He looked out of shape. He just looked like, like if you put him in a trucker hat and a flannel, he looked like he about to ride in a big rig. You know what I'm saying? But you had him go up against Hulk Hogan. Like, you probably didn't think to yourself, like, there's no way that Earthquake is going to beat Hulk Hogan. Like, you knew this, but they made him look like a unstoppable force. You know, so why can't they do the same thing with Bobby Lashley? They're building this guy up, and regardless to if he ends up winning or losing, which I feel like he will lose, to Drew McIntyre, then he's built up. And then there's other things that they want to do with Bobby Lashley. There's real reports that talking about they want to put him in a match with Brock Lesnar. So you want to make him look as dominant and just as tough as you want him to be. So that's the way I'm looking at it. And as far as, Riddle, I think Riddle proved himself. You can not like the whole stoner gimmick or whatever like that, him just seeming like he kind of dense. But dude can go in the ring. And I think, and to me, that Royal Rumble that he was in, it really proved something to me. And I think it proved something to a lot of people in the back. That this guy can really go. And I got a lot of respect for Riddle, regardless to what people may think about it. And Drew McIntyre, I just feel like this is WWE trying to give him his moment. You know what I'm saying? Rather, it's going to be, Lashley going into, if they decide to do a triple threat match, right? Miz, Lashley, McIntyre at Fastlane. Rather, it's Bobby Lashley end up walking into, WrestleMania as the champion and Drew beating him, or it's just Drew coming in as a champion, leaving as a champion. Drew deserves his moment, man. This guy's been carrying the WWE, and the guy looks like a legit badass. He looks tough. He looks the part. He believes in himself. People have been talking about ratings and all that kind of stuff and talking about this guy's a rating killer. Trust and believe, man, the ratings aren't falling because of Drew McIntyre. Drew McIntyre can go in the ring. He's good on the mic, and he's believable as a champion. I think the two best guys that you believe were champions, that could be champions, were the champions for the last few months, and that's Roman Reigns and Drew McIntyre. Anybody else, you probably just want a guy to get opportunity. All the dudes that doing all that flippy dippy crap, I just feel like it's about believability. It's about, can a guy go out there and you legitimately believe that a guy can kick his ass? I can care less about dudes hitting 630s and 450 splashes and me and people saying, oh, he deserves a chance. Like, nah, bro. Like, if a guy's going out there putting on stellar matches, then you have my attention. But it's just because a guy can, hit a backflip on all type of inanimate objects and all that kind of crap, I can care less. But I'm liking the buildup of Bobby Lashley. I like the fact that they put the belt on the Miz just to try to get the money in the bank out of his hands. And I just like the way that they're trying to set this stuff up for WrestleMania. But those are my thoughts, man. Nothing else really stood out to me. We all knew Roman Reigns was going to win. We all knew that Nia Jax and Shayna Baszler was going to win. I was pretty sure that Riddle was going to be the United States champion. That's the reason why they had the triple threat match. I knew that the person that was going to be the third person in the match that wasn't Lashley was going to get pinned by Riddle. So that stuff didn't really surprise me. Not at all, man. But I would love to hear from you. What do you think about Stone Cold Steve Austin? And for those that watch the Elimination Chamber, what did you think about that? Please comment down below, like and share this video. This has been the TJ Knows Wrestling podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for your time. Please subscribe to the channel, youtube.com, search TJ Knows Wrestling, and also on Facebook, facebook.com, search TJ Knows Wrestling. Till next time,